The pre-dawn silence of December 19th, 1944, was broken by the guttural cough of a Maybach engine before it sputtered and died. For a moment, the Ardennes forest returned to silence. Then another engine failed, and another, until the entire column of German Tiger tanks stood motionless in the snow. Steam curled from exhausts into the freezing air as crews climbed out. Confusion etched on their faces. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked from a farmhouse. The most powerful armored spearhead of the Waffen SS, the pride of Hitler's 6th Panzer Army, had come to an unexpected halt on a lonely Belgian road. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper climbed down from his command tank, his boots crunching on the ice as he looked at the frozen convoy, stretching back along the road. 67 tanks, dozens of half-tracks, self-propelled guns and trucks, all silent. His driver reported what Peiper already feared. The fuel tanks were empty. The reserve drums were dry. Their engines had drunk the last drops during the night advance. The night before, they had broken through American lines at Stoumont after brutal fighting. Several Sherman tanks lay burning by the roadside, their crews frozen where they had fallen. The Tigers had crushed American defenses like paper, advancing farther than any German column in the Ardennes offensive. Now, just 20 miles from the Meuse River, the objective that might split the Allied front, they sat powerless. Peiper felt the weight of the situation pressing down like the winter sky. The whole offensive depended on speed, on shock, on momentum. Every hour lost was fatal. Somewhere beyond the hills, American engineers were blowing bridges, torching fuel dumps and calling in reinforcements. Time was their enemy, and time was running out. Peiper's men began siphoning fuel from every vehicle that still had a few liters left. Crews worked in silence, breath steaming, hands numb. They drained motorcycles, supply trucks, even abandoned American jeeps. The captured gasoline sloshed into jerry cans, but it was never enough. The Tigers were thirsty beasts, each drinking over 2 gallons of fuel per mile. At this rate, Peiper knew, they could advance perhaps another 10 kilometers before stalling again. It was a nightmare he had foreseen from the beginning. At the final briefing days earlier, Sepp Dietrich had been blunt. You have enough fuel to reach the Meuse only if you capture American supplies. The mathematics of failure had been built into the plan. The men were exhausted. For 3 days they had fought and driven almost without rest. Snow clung to their greatcoats. Faces were blackened with smoke and grime. They had captured depots at Honsfeld and Bühlingen, seizing thousands of gallons of precious American gasoline. For a brief moment they had felt unstoppable, believing perhaps fate had favored them. But what they had captured was already gone, consumed in the desperate push westward. Now, with tanks standing dead in the road, they were beginning to understand the truth. Their miracle had been only a drop in an ocean. Peiper ordered the column to hold position while reconnaissance scouted ahead for more fuel depots. Hours dragged by. The forest was silent except for the distant rumble of American artillery. Once a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts roared overhead, strafing roads behind them, cutting off their retreat. Peiper stared westward, toward the Meuse, toward Antwerp, toward the dream of splitting the Allied front. He thought of the burning fuel depot at Stavelot, of the engineers who had torched 2 million gallons rather than let Germans touch it. He thought of the American supply trucks that seemed to appear out of nowhere, of the pipelines pumping oceans of fuel across France. He thought of the numbers, 5 million gallons, allocated for the entire offensive, while the Americans consumed more than that in 2 days. That night, the temperature fell below freezing. Crews huddled in their tanks, running engines only when absolutely necessary to save fuel. Some shared coffee taken from American positions, still marveling at the abundance. They had found depots with pyramids of jerry cans stacked higher than a man's head. They had seen American papers, boasting about new pipelines delivering hundreds of thousands of gallons daily. They had laughed at first, then grown quiet. For German soldiers, gasoline was more precious than bread. They had not seen private automobile traffic in years. Farmers at home were using horses again. The Wehrmacht fought a mechanized war with horse-drawn carts. By dawn, fuel scouts returned empty-handed. No more depots nearby, no captured supplies, nothing to keep the advance moving. Peiper gathered his officers in the icy road. His maintenance officer reported the numbers with brutal honesty. Enough fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse lay 30 kilometers away. To reach it, they would need a miracle bigger than Hansfeld. There would be no miracle this time. Peiper's boots crunched in the snow as he walked the length of the column, past silent tigers and panzerfoes, past half-tracks filled with men staring into the white distance. Some smoked in silence, others cleaned their weapons with numb fingers. The tanks loomed like steel beasts asleep in the frozen dawn, their long barrels pointing toward the west. Toward the river they would never reach. Peiper felt each step as if he were walking through a graveyard. This was supposed to be the spearhead that changed the war, that turned back the tide and forced the Allies to negotiate. Instead, it stood here, bleeding away the last hope of the Reich. One wasted hour at a time. The order came down from higher command. Hold your position at all costs. But holding was not what this attack had been designed for. It was meant to be lightning war, blitzkrieg reborn, fast, unstoppable, terrifying. Now it had turned into something else entirely, a waiting game, a slow strangulation. Somewhere far to the east, the Red Army was pushing into Poland. Every day lost here was another step closer to disaster for the fatherland. The first American counterattacks began that afternoon. Artillery shells whined overhead and burst among the lead vehicles. Snow and mud flew into the air, showering the tanks. A Tiger returned fire, its massive 88mm gun booming, shattering a farmhouse where the enemy observers had been hiding. The battle flared and died quickly, but the message was clear. The Americans were no longer retreating. They were coming back, stronger each hour. And Peiper's column was sitting still, waiting to be encircled. That night, the men burned what little fuel they had to keep their engines warm. A Tiger's engine, if allowed to freeze, might never start again. The drivers took turns sleeping inside the tanks, shivering even with greatcoats and blankets. Outside, the snow fell silently, covering the tracks and the dead alike. The forest smelled of pine smoke and gasoline. Somewhere to the rear, wounded men groaned in the makeshift aid station set up in a farmhouse kitchen. Supplies were running low, food, medicine, and now even ammunition. The men were hungry, tired, and angry. Some cursed the high command for sending them on a mission doomed from the start. Others muttered that Hitler himself had lost his mind. Peiper kept his doubts to himself, but he felt them growing heavier with each passing hour. He remembered the briefing before the offensive. The generals had spoken of capturing Antwerp, of cutting off the Allies, of forcing them to sue for peace. They had spoken of history-changing course, of one final victory that would buy time to finish the V-weapons and jet fighters that might yet save Germany. It had sounded bold, even glorious. Now, standing in the snow beside his silent tanks, it sounded like a death sentence. On December 22nd, the Americans struck again, harder this time. Shermans and infantry closed in from multiple directions, trying to cut the road. Peiper's Tigers roared to life, burning the last reserves of fuel to break through the encirclement. The ground shook as the Tigers fired, blowing apart American tanks at point-blank range. For hours, the forest echoed with the thunder of battle. By nightfall, the Germans still held the road, but at a terrible cost. Several Tigers had been knocked out or immobilized, burning hulks glowing in the snow. Their crews lay frozen where they had fallen. When the firing stopped, Peiper assembled his officers once again. There was no fuel left, none at all. Even if they captured a depot tonight, they could no longer refuel every vehicle. It was time to face the truth. The breakout to the Meuse was finished. The dream of Antwerp was over. Their orders were now survival, fight their way out, or be surrounded and destroyed. The decision that followed was one of the hardest of Peiper's career. The tanks could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Each Tiger was worth more than a dozen Shermans in battle, and their secrets could not be captured. The crews began preparing demolition charges. In the freezing darkness, they worked with grim faces, setting explosives under engines and gun breeches, loading grenades into turrets. Some men wept quietly as they packed up personal belongings. They had driven these tanks across half of Europe, fought in them, slept in them. To destroy them was like killing a comrade. The first blast echoed through the night like a funeral bell. Flames shot from the hull of the lead Tiger as the charges detonated, blowing the engine to pieces. One by one, the others followed, each explosion lighting up the forest. The sky turned red with fire as Peiper's spearhead died where it stood. The men watched in silence, their faces lit by the flames. Some crossed themselves, others just stared. By dawn, the road was lined with blackened carcasses of tanks, smoke curling upward into the winter sky. There was nothing left to do but march. Peiper gave the order to abandon all remaining vehicles and break out on foot. They carried what they could, rifles, machine guns, A few jerrycans of fuel for the half-tracks that still ran. The rest they left behind. The once proud column that had terrified the Americans now looked like a band of fugitives, trudging through the snow under a gray December sky. Somewhere behind them, the last fire still burned, marking the grave of their offensive. The first hours of the march were silent except for the crunch of boots on the frozen road. Peiper led from the front, his greatcoat wrapped tightly around him, his face hard as stone. Behind him, over 800 men trudged through the snow, leaving behind the wreckage of 60 armored vehicles. Their breath hung in the air like smoke, mixing with the last black plumes rising from the road behind them. Every man knew what it meant. The Kampfgruppe was finished. What had been the sharpest spear of the Ardennes offensive was now nothing more than an infantry column retreating through hostile territory. The forest swallowed them as they moved, and soon even the burning tanks were out of sight. Somewhere behind them, American forces were closing in, finding the smoldering wrecks, counting the tanks, realizing that the German advance had been stopped not by battle alone, but by something far more basic, an empty fuel tank. But for Peiper's men, there was no time to think about history. Every step forward was a step away from capture or death. The cold was merciless. The snow came up to their ankles, sometimes their knees, and the wind cut like knives through their coats. They moved by night, hiding by day, slipping through villages and forests. Whenever they heard engines in the distance, they dove into ditches or barns, waiting for the American patrols to pass. The wounded were carried on sleds or left behind when they could no longer go on. It was a cruel march, one that turned hardened soldiers into silent ghosts. By December 24th, the column had shrunk. Men had been captured, others killed in skirmishes with advancing American units. Peiper refused to surrender, even when officers suggested it. His orders were clear: break out and rejoin German lines. The thought of falling into American hands was unthinkable. Some of the men still remembered what had happened at Malmedy and feared what revenge might come if they were captured alive. On Christmas Eve, they crossed the Amblev River under cover of darkness. The bridge they had once fought to capture now lay behind enemy lines, so they waded through the icy water, clutching rifles above their heads, teeth chattering. Some slipped and were swept away by the current, their cries lost in the night. Those who made it across collapsed on the far bank, too tired even to curse. It was a bitter Christmas, one they would never forget. The breakout continued for 2 more days. Hunger gnawed at them. Ammunition was down to the last magazines. Many no longer had winter boots. Their feet were wrapped in rags. But somehow, by sheer willpower, they pressed on. On December 26th, Peiper and what remained of his Kampfgruppe finally reached German lines near one out of the 5,000 men who had started the offensive with him. Barely 800 remained. The once proud armored column that had been the tip of the spear was now a shattered remnant, exhausted, frostbitten, and empty-handed. When Peiper reported to higher command, there was no congratulations, no words of comfort. The offensive itself was collapsing on every front. The dream of reaching Antwerp had died in the snow. Hitler's gamble had failed, and with it, Germany's last chance to change the war. The tanks they had destroyed would never be replaced. The fuel they had burned could never be regained. For Peiper and his men, the Battle of the Bulge was over. But the memory of that road, of those silent tigers left behind, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Today, in the quiet Belgian village of La Glaise, one of those tigers still stands. Its long barrel points toward the horizon, as if it is still waiting for the order to advance. Its steel is scarred by shrapnel, its tracks rusted by time, but it remains a monument to that frozen December. Tourists come and stare at it, children climb on it, photographers pose in front of it. But for those who know the story, it is more than just a tank. It is a grave marker, a reminder of the day when the most powerful war machine on Earth was stopped not by guns or bombs, but by an empty fuel tank. If you stand there long enough, in the silence of a winter morning, you can almost hear it, the distant rumble of engines, the crunch of boots on snow, the muffled voices of men trying to coax life back into dead machines. You can almost see Peiper standing beside his tank, staring westward, knowing that history had turned against him. And perhaps, if the wind is right, you can almost hear the dull crump of demolition charges as the tigers were put to death by the very men who loved them most. The last journey of the tiger tanks ended not in glory, not in triumph, but in fire and silence. Their hulks still lie in the Ardennes, Some buried in the earth, some displayed in museums, mute witnesses to a moment when the fate of Europe hung in the balance. And though decades have passed, the lesson remains as clear as the winter sky. In war, power is nothing without fuel, and even the mightiest army can be brought to its knees by something as simple as an empty tank.